Is it worthwhile to think about ethics or ethical dilemmas? Is it possible to improve my understanding of ethics or to improve my views about what's moral? Is it necessary? Some reactions to ethical discussion suggest a no answer to one or more of these questions, and that inclination may be motivated by what I'll call dismissive notions about ethics. In contrast with these dismissive notions, consider ethical objectivism. It's the idea that there are at least some universally valid moral standards. These standards are valid independently of cultural acceptance. They're independent of feelings or perceptions about morality. Most objectivists also commit to some specific moral standards, and they claim that those standards are valid for everyone, regardless whether they agree or not. For example, one objectivist I know thinks that torturing animals for fun is wrong. And he thinks that even people who live in cultures where it's accepted behave wrongly when they torture animals for fun. Theoretically, you could be an objectivist without committing to the validity of any particular moral standard. You could believe there must be some such standards without being confident about what they are. Dismissive notions about ethics are often employed or arrived at when someone argues against ethical objectivism. Take, for example, ethical relativism and ethical anti-realism. According to relativism, there are no universally valid moral standards. There are valid standards, but they're only valid relative to some perspective, usually a set of cultural practices. So which standards are valid varies depending on cultural acceptance or perhaps an individual's attitudes, feelings, and sentiments. Some relativists would also add that moral statements like torturing animals for fun is wrong report those cultural systems, attitudes, feelings, and or sentiments rather than stating moral truths. The relativist might say, for example, that in America, or for most Americans, torturing animals for fun is wrong. But since it depends on cultural acceptance or something similar, there might be a place somewhere where torturing animals for fun is okay. Then there's ethical anti-realism, which in a way goes further. Anti-realism is the view that there are no moral standards that are valid at all. An anti-realist thinks that morality is a fiction, invented by humans. Commonly, anti-realists believe that all of reality is really descriptive in nature, and that no normative statements are ever true. Of course, people still can and do enforce their invented moral standards on others through laws, police, and so forth, but nothing is really wrong or right, not even relative to culture or the individual. Let's look at some of the arguments that have been offered against objectivism and in favor of some of these more dismissive notions. First, we should set aside a couple of arguments that embody a confusion about what objectivism is. Sometimes people seem to think that objectivism can't account for situational differences. They say things like, well, it's wrong to steal cars for kicks, but if you're starving and you steal food from someone who's using it as display art, then that's not wrong. So stealing's not okay in one situation, but it is okay in another situation. This is supposed to defeat objectivism. However, the argument assumes that objectivism is the same thing as absolutism. Absolutism is just one possible objectivist standpoint, but objectivism can also be situation-based. Consider the difference. According to absolutism, not only are there universally valid ethical standards, but the application of those standards is not sensitive to context. No matter what the situation someone is in, their specific obligations will be the same, and the same verdicts will be reached about their actions as would be reached in any other situation. For example, an absolutist about stealing thinks that it's just as wrong to steal food for your family as it is to steal cars for kicks. An absolutist about killing might say it's just as wrong to kill someone in self-defense as it is to walk up to a stranger and kill them. But objectivism can also take situations into account. There are lots of objectivist standpoints that are situation-based. Situation-based objectivism is the idea that there are universally valid moral standards, But when applied to different situations, these standards yield different prescriptions about what to do and different verdicts about what has been done. Now, in fact, this argument about situational differences seems especially confused because it actually appeals to objectivism while supposedly arguing against it. In arguing that different situations call for different measures, the arguer claims everyone should agree that stealing, for example, is wrong in one situation, but permissible in another. Another anti-objectivist argument assumes that moral norms are just like any other kind of norms. The arguer points out the absurdity of universalizing certain non-moral norms, and then concludes that no norms can be universal. So imagine an American who finds out that people in Japan slurp their ramen noodles, and immediately concludes they must be rude people who need to be retrained in proper etiquette. That seems silly and close-minded. You can adjust to a little slurping, and besides, it just tastes better that way. Neither way of eating seems objectively superior, at least not obviously, and it doesn't much matter either way. But we needn't conclude that all norms will fall into that pattern. Moral norms are much more important than other kinds of norms. In fact, they seem to concern exactly the kind of situations where adjustment can't be reasonably expected. Now, there are anti-objectivist arguments that don't get distracted or confused about what objectivism implies. One such argument is what philosophers call the argument from difference or disagreement. This argument emphasizes the fact that we find different moral beliefs and practices within different cultures or subcultural groups. In one culture, homosexuality is accepted. In another, it's illegal. In one society, people generally think it's morally wrong to eat dogs, while in another, they think it's okay. We could multiply examples, but that doesn't really add anything to the logic of the argument. It's sometimes asserted, and it might be true, that no moral standards are universally accepted. Thus, the argument goes, objectivism must be false. No moral standards are universally valid. Hence, the argument is often formulated with just one premise and a conclusion. However, it's worth asking about the connection between them. To make this inference work, it's necessary to assume that the validity of a moral standard consists in its being accepted. But that assumption is dubious. Generally, when people arrive at different answers to a question, it doesn't prove that there is no objectively correct answer. There's actually little or nothing that everyone on Earth agrees on. Even something as well established as the fact that the Earth is round is denied by many people. But we don't conclude that the Earth is flat for them and it's round for us. Flat Earthers just have an incorrect belief. Some people think there's a God, others don't. One of them must be incorrect, even if I don't know which one. And even if I'm unsure about the moral status of, say, eating dogs, that doesn't mean it's whatever people say it is. If one person thinks it's wrong and another person thinks it's okay, one of them could just be incorrect. Another common argument against objectivism focuses on tolerance. And these days, most people are familiar with the problems that intolerance can bring. Tolerance, conversely, is an agreeable notion. Sometimes it's suggested that relativism goes along with tolerance or supports tolerance more than objectivism does. But if you try and formulate this argument more precisely, problems begin to emerge. Is it the idea that we should be tolerant, and therefore we should be relativist? That doesn't make any sense. Such an argument appeals to objectively valid norms about what we should do, but then concludes that there are no objectively valid norms. That's self-contradictory. Now, it does seem plausible that tolerance is a good thing, within limits, which is to say that it's an objectively valid moral standard. But the idea that relativism supports tolerance as a moral standard is confused. Relativism implies that moral standards are pliable. It says whatever a cultural group endorses is valid for that group. And plenty of human cultural institutions have endorsed intolerance. What could the relativists say about those cultural institutions? Only that intolerance is a moral value for them although it's not a moral value for us. So far, I've just been pointing out flaws in the arguments for relativism and anti-realism. But even if an argument is flawed, it doesn't mean its conclusion is false. So what can be said against relativism and anti-realism and in favor of objectivism? Perhaps the most influential arguments point out that these views have implications that seem false. The logical principle involved is as follows. If we're confident that a theory is true, we should be equally confident that its implications are true. Conversely, if our confidence that the implications are false outweighs our confidence in the theory itself, then we should reject the theory. This is the basis upon which scientists make predictions based on theories, but then also reject those theories if the corresponding predictions are empirically disconfirmed. Now, consider some of the problematic implications of relativism and anti-realism. For one, they imply seemingly incorrect moral equivalencies. For example, in the late 1930s, Hitler was regarded as a hero, possibly by as many people as Gandhi. Within their respective cultures, their reputations were similar. Hitler, arguably the more revered out of the two. According to relativism, then, Hitler and Gandhi have about the same moral status. As a relativist, you would have to admit this even if you don't like Hitler, even if you're a member of the anti-Hitler culture, because of his status within his own culture. Another relativist implication is that the prevailing culture is always right. Since morals only become valid by being endorsed within some culture, any insider who voices disagreement is automatically wrong. So an abolitionist in the time of slavery who says, wait a minute, this is wrong, that person would be wrong, automatically. And Socrates was wrong, Martin Luther was wrong, MLK was wrong. Anyone who tries to challenge their society, wrong. On a macro level, there would be no such thing as societal progress, only value systems that change for ultimately no good reason. On the other hand, if individuals can create their own subculture wherein the mainstream culture is wrong, then anyone can decide to endorse any value they want, and that becomes right for them. And this would mean that the actions of someone like Albert Fish, the serial child torturer murderer, weren't really wrong. They just conflict with the values that the rest of us happen to endorse. Okay, the analogy with scientific disconfirmation may not be perfect, but the essential logic of the situation is the same. We must weigh our confidence in relativist or anti-realist doctrines against our confidence that these implications are false. Now, the doctrines are motivated primarily by abstract notions that objective truth has to look a certain way, and moral claims don't conform to those expectations. So the question is this: are you more confident in these abstract theoretical notions about objective truth, or are you more confident that slavery and genocide are bad things? How sure are you that if I were to kidnap an 8-year-old boy and torture him to death as Albert Fish did for his own enjoyment, that that would be a bad thing? The point is, certain concrete moral judgments seem very epistemically secure. Some things are just obviously wrong or right. And if that's really true, then relativism, anti-realism, and similar doctrines must be rejected. Now, not all dismissive notions about ethics are so closely connected with relativism or anti-realism. There's one that has to do with the relationship between morality and religion. It's sometimes been said that atheism entails relativism or anti-realism. The Russian novelist Dostoevsky famously put it this way: if God does not exist, then everything is permissible. One idea that seems to drive this kind of thinking is what philosophers have called divine command theory. According to divine command theory, God's commands don't just tell us that something is right or wrong. They are what makes it right or wrong. In the same way that political laws are only laws because the government declares them to be, moral laws come into existence when and in virtue of God's declaring them. So suppose someone grows up believing that this is the relationship between God and morality. But then later in life they become convinced that there is no God. Consequently, they reject objectivism. We could call this reasoning the atheistic argument against objectivism. The first premise is that for a moral standard to be universally valid means that it's commanded by God. This is divine command theory. The second premise is that God doesn't exist. So we conclude there are no universally valid moral standards. Maybe some would conclude that there are no valid standards at all. Now, if the second premise is false, then the argument fails, but that's a whole different can of worms. However, even if you think God does exist, it's worth noting that there are problems with the first premise, divine command theory. In fact, it was rejected by the early Christian theologians and other philosophers who did believe in God for a variety of reasons. Perhaps the most influential argument against it was given by Plato around 400 BCE in a dialogue called Euthyphro. Euthyphro is a young man who endorses divine command theory, and in response Socrates asks him whether God commands or forbids something because it's right or wrong, or whether it's right or wrong because God commands or forbids it. The question and the ensuing argument is commonly known as Euthyphro's Dilemma. Let's take a specific example, randomly walking up to someone and killing them. Is random killing wrong because God forbids it, or does God forbid it because it's wrong? Notice that the first choice is divine command theory. Now, it can't be both, because then the explanation of it being wrong would just go in a circle. Plato thinks the answer has to be B. God forbids random killing because it's wrong. Whatever reasons God has for forbidding random killing, they would constitute the wrongness of it. But on the other hand, if it only becomes wrong because God forbids it, then there are no reasons. God's decision to forbid random killing is just arbitrary or random, as if he just picked something out of a hat. If there was a time before God forbade it, well, then it wasn't wrong then. And if it's just a random choice, then there's no way of knowing God wouldn't change the status of random killing. It could become right tomorrow. One thing that emerges from this discussion is that divine command theory is not the only model of the relationship between God and morality. On another model, God's commands tell us that something is right or wrong, but it's already objectively right or wrong for reasons we may or may not understand. That means that if someone becomes convinced that there is no God, they don't have to conclude that morality can't be objective. Notice also that even if you think God does exist, divine command theory would still qualify as a dismissive notion about ethics, just in a different way. Sure, morality would be objective, but it wouldn't be possible for human beings to make any progress by thinking about ethics. There would be nothing to figure out or understand, no underlying connections between God's commands. And if the extent Scripture didn't provide an answer to a moral dilemma, there would be nothing to do but sit around and wait for God to decide the answer and tell you. So, setting divine command theory aside clears the way for ethical thought. Whether God exists or doesn't exist, there's no reason that humans can't make progress by thinking about ethics, whether it's applied ethics or theoretical ethics. Another notion that's dismissive without necessarily being anti-objectivist is egoism. Instead of arguing against the validity of moral standards, egoism questions whether or not we should care. To the egoist, the only standard of behavior that's binding on everyone is the one that everyone unavoidably follows anyway. Do what benefits yourself. The ancient Greek sophist Antiphon, for example, claimed that if people followed their natural instincts, they would take things from others whenever they could. They would even hurt or kill others when it suited them. We have laws to prevent this kind of thing, and of course, if it doesn't benefit you, if you get caught. But Antiphon claimed that the best way to live was to pretend to care about morality while secretly caring only about yourself. So whenever you know you won't get caught, you should disregard morality completely. Philosophers today distinguish between a couple of claims that may be at play here. First, there's psychological egoism. It's the view that everyone is naturally and unavoidably selfish. People are fundamentally incapable of true altruism. This is a descriptive claim. And there was also a claim about the best way to live, which is often called ethical egoism. It's the idea that a person should pursue their own self-interest at the expense of anyone else's. Now, this is a normative claim, although it's somewhat unclear what kind of norms are really at stake. Is an egoist like Antiphon saying that, contrary to popular belief, purely self-serving behavior really is moral? Or are they saying that we should disregard morality in some non-moral sense of should? There's a further distinction about egoism that's also worth noting. Antiphon suggests, because you should really do whatever benefits you, traditional ideas about morality should be tossed out the window. Stealing isn't really wrong, or if it is, who cares? It benefits you. Murder? Sometimes it's just a good way to get ahead. Let's label this revisionist ethical egoism, since it revises traditional notions about morality. But suppose someone agreed with this egoist definition of morality, doing whatever benefits you, but then they thought that it turns out the things that benefit you are the things that have traditionally been considered moral anyway. Stealing and murder don't benefit you in the long run because they negatively affect your psyche or something like that. Helping others, being honest and just and so forth, are actually the most beneficial things in the long run, for psychological reasons perhaps. Plato seems to have held a view somewhat like this. Let's call this traditionalist ethical egoism. So while traditionalist ethical egoism might not be a dismissive notion, revisionist ethical egoism seems to be. After all, there isn't much to think about specifically in ethics if it just reduces to a cost-benefit analysis. It's essentially just the same thing as an individualized form of economics. But what's the reasoning behind ethical egoism? Well, maybe someone would argue that we shouldn't try to fight our natural inclinations. Selfishness is built into our DNA, so we should just go with it. However, notice that the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from that premise. Because people naturally are a certain way doesn't mean that's the best way to be, in any sense of the best way to be. Maybe some people are naturally lazy. That wouldn't mean it was the best way to live. Someone might like to be selfish. Someone might enjoy being selfish. But that doesn't mean it's the best way to live. Best doesn't always mean the most enjoyable. The contemporary philosopher, James Rachels, has argued that ethical egoism recommends an irrational sort of behavior, and for that reason, it's logical to recommend against it. Now here's my take on that argument. It's only logical to treat individuals differently if they have different characteristics or behaviors that are relevant to the treatment in question. If a parent of two children is going to ground one of them for a week, that only makes sense if that child has done something the other child hasn't done.
I love you. However, I hate you.
But I'm identical in every way with Alice 27.
Yes, of course. That is exactly why I hate you. Because you are identical.
If the parent just randomly chooses one child to punish, we think that's unfair, and it doesn't make any sense. It's arbitrary. If a student is going to get more time on a test, this is only logical if that student has some condition that makes the extra time necessary, like a sprained wrist. This also seems to be why we think that racism and sexism are unfair. Take, for example, the racist employer who refuses to hire black people. That's treating someone differently based on physical characteristics that aren't relevant to the different treatment. So, returning now to revisionist ethical egoism, it says that I should treat myself as the only person that matters for all purposes whatsoever. However, is there anything about me that justifies this preferential treatment? It seems that I couldn't possibly be that special. No one could. Antiphon says that if I'm sure I can get away with stealing someone else's car, I should go ahead and do it. But I should also do my best to prevent others from stealing my car. Now, how could that make sense? Is there something special about me that I deserve to steal cars while others don't deserve to steal my car? There doesn't seem to be. So, I'm giving someone special treatment without justification. The person I'm giving special treatment happens to be me, but that doesn't make it any more reasonable. So much for egoism. Now, I've outlined a number of the dismissive notions about ethics that seem most likely to come up in the context of ethical discussions, although there may be more. Typically, in discussing ethical theory or practical ethical issues, philosophers take it for granted that these dismissive notions have been set aside. And for the most part, it's necessary to set them aside if we're interested in questions like, what makes something right or wrong? Or what forms of self-expression should or shouldn't be tolerated in the workplace? Philosophy asks that you think through such issues and produce reasoned conclusions about them. Often there's a temptation to say things like, well, everybody just has their own opinions about it, or the company's just going to tell us what we have to do anyway, or I just believe what I believe because it's in my scripture. These answers rely on oversimplified, dismissive notions about ethics. Essentially, they aren't really answers at all. They're more like ways of avoiding the questions. And maybe there are times when it's appropriate to avoid certain questions, but not in the context of a discussion that's supposed to be about ethics in the first place.